Tonight on Primetime, Ukraine's politics takes the spotlight after an ousted defense minister calls for wartime elections. With mounting pressure at home and Russian attacks abroad, can Ukraine keep its focus? Welcome to Prime Time. I'm James Ezimoha. Now, Ukraine's debate over elections is back in focus after ousted Defense Minister Mikhailo Fedorov called for a presidential vote despite the ongoing war. Elections have been suspended under martial law since Russia's full-scale invasion, making his call a new test for Kyiv's political system.
Ukraine's recently dismissed former defense minister Mikhailo Fedorov has called for a wartime presidential election in the most direct political challenge to Volodymyr Zelensky. It's despite elections being suspended in the country since martial law was imposed at the start of the full-scale invasion by Russia in 2022. He said that Ukraine had to restore a full democratic process even amid a prolonged war, in a video address released online late Tuesday evening.
Democracy cannot be held hostage by Russia. We must find a lawful, safe and realistic mechanism that would allow Ukraine to restore a fully functioning democratic process, even under conditions of a long war. We are facing a systemic governance crisis. The old system lives by its own rules too often. It protects itself, fears change, makes decisions slowly, and may punish the initiative while rewarding loyalty.
Hours earlier, Zelensky confirmed he had asked Parliament to confirm Yevhen Kamara as the new defense minister, effectively closing the door on a Fedorov comeback. Last month, Fedorov was unexpectedly fired from his role, just 6 months after his appointment. He was suddenly dropped by Zelensky in a government reshuffle after a falling out with military commander General Alexander Syrsky. Street protests followed, leading to the sacking of Syrsky, but there was no sign Fedorov would be reinstated. Fedorov's call is the first such demand by a major Ukrainian political figure since the war began. The president's office has yet to issue a statement on Fedorov's latest remarks. Zelensky's term ended in May 2024, but the country has postponed its presidential election due to continuing martial law.
Now, still in Ukraine, Fedorov's call for a presidential vote has also sparked debate on the streets of Kyiv. Supporters have backed the idea, but some say elections would be hard to hold while the war with Russia continues.
Protesters calling for elections in Ukraine are confronting a fundamental question. How can a vote be organized while the war continues? At a rally in central Kyiv, demonstrators backed former defense minister Mikhailo Fedorov's call for elections, but many also questioned whether they could realistically be held.
I don't see a way to hold elections. I'd like to, but I don't see a way. Anything is possible here. I'd like to believe it will happen, because we don't know when the war will end, and our government is losing touch with reality, and we need to renew the government. Unfortunately, we can't do without it.
Fedorov, removed as defense minister in July, has argued that the country is facing a crisis of governance and needs elections. Ukrainian law prohibits them under martial law. A displaced resident from Zaporizhzhia said holding a vote in areas close to the front line would be particularly difficult.
I support Fedorov's statement, but I don't think there will be an election. I think Volodymyr Zelensky should simply step down.
Fedorov was once a close ally of Zelensky and is now a potential political rival. But he has not said whether he would run for office. On Wednesday, Ukraine's parliament approved the appointment of Yevhen Kamara as defense minister. Zelensky had nominated Kamara, whom he previously appointed as acting minister, following Fedorov's removal last month.
All right, let's talk to Maria Ulyanovska, Ukrainian journalist, joining us from Washington, D.C. Good to have you, ma'am.
Thank you for having me. Hi.
All right, now, Fedorov is calling for elections soon after leaving Zelensky's government. Why make this argument now? And what does the timing tell us about the political tension inside Kyiv?
So I think this is a key question to ask, because the question whether Ukraine should hold elections during the wartime is not new. Different players have been raising this question since the autumn of 2023, when Ukraine was scheduled under normal circumstances, if not for the war, to hold those elections, but didn't have them because of the Russia's full-scale invasion in Ukraine. Now, why is this call coming from now former ally of President Zelensky, Mikhailo Fedorov? And I would remind that Fedorov was the part of core team of Volodymyr Zelensky in his 2019 election campaign, and stayed with him till almost recently when he was fired as a minister of defense. And we've seen the protests on the street. We've seen a lot of demands from people, and Zelensky has met some of them. He has fired his commander-in-chief that people demanded him to fire. He has appointed a different minister of defense that was not his first choice, listening to the people on the street. But reinstating Fedorov as the Minister of Defense was one key demand that Zelensky was not willing to meet, and showed that he will not meet. And it also would be weird to see how this dynamics could be reversed, and how these two political players could play along in one team after such a debacle. So what was happening with the protests? They were getting smaller and smaller within every week. Yesterday was the day before new Minister of Defense was voted by the Ukrainian parliament. And essentially after this, there is no meaning in this protest anymore, because Ukraine will have the acting Minister of Defense. And for Mikhailo Fedorov, that's that his big moment, the moment where he got a lot of political gain, a lot of attraction, a lot of attention and support from people, this moment is passing. And what is next for him is a critical question. And so Ukraine sees, and people in Ukraine and analytics say that this was an ill advice on behalf of his political advisors, who told him that this could be supported by the people of Ukraine, because Ukrainians, by vast majority, do not support elections during the wartime. And if you travel to Ukraine, you understand why, because security is the key issue here. But there are also a lot of other reasons why formally announcing election is not enough. There has to be a security framework around it. There has to be a legal framework around it. You've talked about how under martial law holding such elections is impossible, but also the question of providing safety. You see that Russia is shelling Ukraine with ballistic missiles every day. There is a lack of air security, air defense, rockets, and Russia is killing civilians every day, very far from the front lines, may I say. So there is not a safe place in Ukraine to hold these elections. And a lot of events that would involve people coming together in one place are now cancelled because of the security issues. The second one is that Russia will almost certainly try to interfere with this election. Ukraine has seen this in almost every election since gaining independence. There is this Russian trace where Russia puts particular candidates or tries to meddle with the Ukrainian elections. So there is also this huge risk. One is the question of access. Millions of Ukrainians now live abroad, and there needs to be an organized system of voting possibilities for them. I've spoken to one of the election analysts who say that just in Poland there has to be at least 400 polls for Ukrainians to come and vote that have to be installed, and this is a question that is not being addressed by the foreign countries, at least right now. Moreover, it is impossible in the wartime to ensure the level playing field in elections. People who can participate in such elections, people who can organize this campaign, are already the people who are in power. People in the military are busy right now. They cannot stop fighting Russia and just go and participate in election campaign. So there is also a question of legitimacy of whether such elections won't be contested afterwards.
Now, Maria, you spoke to Melinda Harin after Fedorov's removal, and she questioned why Zelensky made that decision, if you remember. What do you make of how the political landscape in Ukraine has evolved so far?
This is a tough question, but it's been a question ever since Zelensky has got elected as a president. We saw that his choices for his team for different ministers were based mostly on what new faces he could find, what new faces could sell him on how qualified they are. And there were a lot of people who are saying that he also chooses more of loyalty rather than how qualified a person is. So that is one question. Another question, another layer that played up after the full-scale invasion is that Zelensky is extremely focused on foreign policy, on getting foreign help, on getting all the foreign leaders aboard on helping Ukraine. He has this big personal brand that is very helpful for Ukraine in this foreign policy by talking to people, not as a politician, but as a human being, by being able to connect to foreign leaders. Zelensky was able to get a lot of support for Ukraine, and we see he has this dance with Donald Trump trying to prove to him that Ukraine is a good ally, that he should back Ukraine, not Russia, in this war. So he's very focused on that. And because of that, his involvement in the inner politics is not as prominent. And when he does get involved, there is usually some layer of trouble that is coming, because one person cannot simply know everything about everything and be the final expert. But being a president, he has to take responsibility over that. That to say, Ukraine is a parliamentary republic, and parliament, because of the wartime, because of the wartime laws, has started playing less and less of an active role, and Ukraine is de facto becoming a more, the executive power is getting more and more traction in Ukraine, and that is a problem for a power system where one leader is making all the final decisions and surrounds himself with people who are loyal rather than people who are competent in certain fields. So that might be the consequence of that.
Now, Fedorov says Ukraine needs democratic renewal, but what do Ukrainians actually want right now? Is it an election during the war, or political stability until the fighting ends?
There is a major understanding amongst Ukrainians on this question. So according to the recent polls, only 15% believe that elections should be held immediately, even before the war ends. And that same question was raised in 2023 when the elections were supposed to happen in Ukraine. And back then, 16% agreed that the elections should still happen. So we see that there is consistency here, and that is because Ukrainians live in those conditions every day, understand that fair elections are not possible right now because of the war, not because Ukrainians do not want the change of power or don't believe in democracy. It is because it's impossible to hold free and fair elections in the active war zone. And we've seen some examples during history. The US likes to bring the example of American elections during World War II, but then Ukrainians remind Americans that bombs were not flying over the Washington, New York, Chicago while that was happening. So it's a little different question. So 23% of Ukrainians say that elections should happen only after a ceasefire, and the ceasefire has to be accompanied by reliable security guarantees. So security is the key issue here. And 57% of Ukrainians say that elections should wait until the final peace agreement and the complete end of the war. And it's also interesting that Volodymyr Zelensky himself has changed his position on this question a bit. If in the beginning he was very skeptical about the possibility of holding such elections in Ukraine, as time went by, he started saying that he would gladly have the election on any given day. And we know that the American president, Donald Trump, has raised this question with Volodymyr Zelensky too. So Zelensky says that Ukraine is willing and ready to hold elections on the next day when Russia stops its war in Ukraine. He says that ceasefire is a deal breaker here. He has to be able to provide safety for his people. And he also says that there has to be a temporary ceasefire and security guarantees. And these are both reasons that Russia does not take seriously and does not agree to. We've heard the recent remarks from Lavrov, who says that ceasefire is not going to happen, and the Russians are trying to bring more and more death upon Ukrainians in this vital time where there is a lack of air defense systems, and Russia keeps producing more and more ballistic missiles to send to peaceful Ukrainian cities.
Thank you. Now, let's say the elections eventually happen. What kind of change might voters be looking for after years of war?
Oh, that is a very big question, and I think for Iranians, a lot of changes will be required. But also, it also heavily depends on how this war ends. Because if Russia fulfills its military goals, there will be no fair elections in Ukraine, and you can see that in Russia. Russia has held elections in 2023. Russia is holding elections this year, but no one sane mind can say that these elections are free, and this is the actual will of the people of Russia. So if Ukraine doesn't win this war, that is the future we're looking at. And if we are not looking at this grim scenario, and if Ukraine wins the war, gets back the territories, gets security guarantees, and is finally left alone from Russia, the questions are, the question of democracy in Ukraine is still thriving. Has all of this corruption investigations that are happening very actively and very public. So this is, for a lot of European experts, for instance, is a key sign that democracy is working. I think for a lot of the big question is to a little bit of to stabilize this imbalance that is happening right now because of the martial law, that the executive power has more control over what's happening rather than the parliament, because after all, Ukraine is a parliamentary republic and has been so since it's all of its history. So Ukrainians are not used to rely on just one man. We're people of a lot of strong opinions, and the representative system in the parliament is very important for Ukrainians. So I think this would be the key issues to fix after this imbalance of the military time, but also, of course, the question of reconstruction, the question of reintegrating the occupied territories, the question of taking care of the families who have lost everything, the question of reimbursement from the Russian war and accountability for Russia for the war crimes, the justice. These are all the questions that Ukrainians will be bringing up on the election day when it happens.
Now, finally, Maria, does this present an opportunity for Moscow to exploit the division inside Ukraine, or could a credible vote actually strengthen Ukraine's position?
talked about it, that credible vote is a big question here. It's a big if, it's a big how to make it happen. There are so many issues here at play. So the credibility, the legitimacy of these elections will definitely be questioned if the elections are held before the war is over. And of course, answering to your question, of course, Russia will try to use this, as Russia has tried to use its influence within Ukrainian media, Ukrainian political system, with the saboteurs, with the spies and agents. We've seen that in Moldova just recently. We've seen this all over the place. We see now this in Georgia, in all these countries where Russia has its influence. And it's very familiar for Ukrainians because Russia has been trying to influence Ukrainian politics since we've gained independence, and it's been a constant issue. And you can see how it is important for Russia that Ukraine does hold elections before the war is over, because Russia keeps bringing this up all the time. They're saying that Kyiv's regime is illegitimate. They say that President Zelensky is illegitimate, that Ukraine is not a real state because we haven't had elections in so long, and we see a lot of Russian propaganda being spread here in the United States. Tucker Carlson is always calling Ukrainian president illegitimate because we don't have elections. So this is obviously a big and strong point for Russia, and Russia is trying to make it happen and has been trying to make it happen ever since 2023, because they are just simply dissatisfied with the government of Ukraine that is actively fighting against it and doing the best it can to stop Russia's invasion in Ukraine and get more military and humanitarian help and bring Russia to accountability, because that's definitely not what they've counted for. And so absolutely it is in the Russia's interest that Ukraine does hold elections, because in this critical time it will be very easy to meddle with these elections because we're at the wartime.
Thank you. That was Maria Ulyanovska, Ukrainian journalist, joining us from Washington, D.C. Thank you for your time, man.
Thank you.
All right, after the break, we'll check in with our correspondents around the globe. Stay with us. Welcome back to Prime Time. Now, Tehran is making the lifting of the U.S. naval blockade a key condition for any new deal. Iran's chief negotiator says the demand remains unchanged as efforts to reach an agreement continues. Turaj Shirelilu reports from Tehran.
Iran's parliament speaker says Tehran will keep the Strait of Hormuz closed to maritime traffic until the United States fulfills commitments outlined in a memorandum of understanding reached during ceasefire talks in Islamabad in June. Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, who led Iran's delegation in the U.S.-Iran negotiations in Pakistan, told Parliament that the strategic waterway would remain closed unless Washington unfreezes Iranian assets and lifts restrictions on Iranian oil exports, which Tehran says were part of the interim agreement that expired on Monday. In a post on X, Ghalibaf also rejected the possibility of Iran making additional concessions under U.S. pressure. He said recent comments by U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and Secretary of War Pete Hegseth about imposing conditions on Iran were not consistent with the terms agreed in Islamabad. The comments come amid statements from Iranian civilian and military officials indicating that Tehran could shift from a defensive to a more offensive military posture if what it describes as a naval blockade of its southern ports in the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman is not lifted. Turaj Shirelilu from Tehran for A News.
Now, Meta is facing another major trial in the U.S. over allegations that its products have caused harm to children. A group of American states has accused the social media giant of violating consumer protection laws. Ira Spitzer reports.
This landmark trial has now kicked off at this courtroom in Oakland, California, and we heard opening arguments both from this consortium of U.S. states as well as from attorneys for Meta. And the main issue here, the focus of the state's argument, is that they say that the way that Meta designed its platforms, Facebook and Instagram, was done to hook children, to make children and teens addicted to these platforms, and that the company continued to do this despite knowing about the harms that its platforms were doing to young users. So California's Deputy Attorney General laying out some pretty strong accusations in her opening remarks. And we also, of course, heard from Meta's lawyers, and they said that the state's claims here are unsubstantiated, and pointed to industry-wide challenges such as age verification, and said that they're in essence being unfairly singled out. But this is a case with major implications. The states are asking for damages of up to $200 billion. That would be equal to several years of Meta's profits. The company is worth more than $1 trillion, but we've really seen a groundswell of activity in the last couple of years here in the U.S. with potential legal liability for Meta over this alleged harm to younger users. We've seen judgments against Meta in the past, although the company has said it plans to appeal those verdicts. But certainly the stakes here are incredibly high. This is really seen as the tip of the iceberg, with thousands of similar lawsuits being prepared around the U.S. And again, really focusing on the design of the products and what Meta knew and when they knew it about what these products might have been doing to younger users. So we're expecting to hear from Meta executives, including Meta's CEO, Mark Zuckerberg, as well as Instagram CEO, Adam Mosseri, over the next 6 to 8 weeks. That's about how long this trial is expected to last. And again, with Meta, this could not only result in potential monetary damages, but also could be just increase the pressure on the company and on U.S. lawmakers and regulators to potentially take more action as far as regulating the alleged effects on younger users. Ira Spitzer for A News in Oakland, California.
Now, Iceland is set to vote on whether to revive talks on joining the European Union, reopening a debate that has been frozen for more than a decade. The referendum could also affect wider plans for EU enlargement. Anita Sharma has more.
Welcome to This Day in Europe, where a referendum in Iceland could have implications far beyond the small Nordic island. Next week, Icelanders vote on whether to restart negotiations to join the EU. Talks Reykjavik abandoned more than a decade ago. Iceland is already closely tied to the bloc through the European Economic Area and the Schengen area, but full membership would take that relationship to the next level. The referendum is not a vote on membership itself. Any eventual deal would require a second referendum, and Brussels is watching closely. EU diplomats tell Reuters that bringing a wealthy, modern economy like Iceland into the bloc could make enlargement more attractive to Europeans wary of admitting less prosperous countries. That could provide a political boost for candidates including Montenegro, Albania, Moldova, and Ukraine. Montenegro hopes to join as early as 2028, and some officials believe its progress alongside Iceland could help overcome resistance to further enlargement. Norway is also watching. Its prime minister recently said Iceland's decision should influence Norwegian attitudes towards the bloc. If Iceland eventually joins, Norway and Liechtenstein would be the only EEA countries remaining outside the bloc. But Icelanders are deeply divided. A Gallup poll this month found 46% support restarting negotiations and 46% oppose it, while a majority still opposes EU membership itself. The debate has been revived by rising living costs and a dramatically different geopolitical landscape, including growing tensions in the Arctic involving both Russia and the U.S. If Iceland votes yes, negotiations could move quickly. EU Enlargement Commissioner Marta Koss says talks could take just 1 to 2 years, but one major obstacle remains: fishing. Iceland fiercely protects its fishing industry and control over its waters. But with fisheries representing a relatively small part of the EU economy, Kos signaled Brussels may be willing to compromise. Because for the EU, Iceland's vote could mean something bigger, a chance to inject new momentum into the bloc's wider enlargement project. For A News, I'm Anita Sharma in Arnhem, Netherlands.
An Israeli strike on a Syrian military airbase has drawn a strong response from Turkey, which says the attack violates Syria's sovereignty. The strike in northwestern Syria has also raised fears of a wider clash between the three countries. This comes as Washington seeks to ease tensions among its regional partners. Adamor reports from Istanbul.
Turkey has condemned in the strongest possible terms an Israeli attack on the Abu el-Duhur military airbase in northwestern Syria near the Turkish border. In a statement, the Turkish Foreign Ministry said the airstrikes had violated Syria's sovereignty and territorial integrity, accusing Israel of staging repeated attacks on Syrian infrastructure and military facilities. Ankara did not say whether Turkish troops had been deployed at the airbase at the time of the attack, which reportedly damaged a runway but didn't cause any casualties. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's office said Syria had been on the verge of violating what it described as a security status quo agreed to with Israel by letting Turkish forces deploy at the airbase. The dispute highlights growing tensions between Israel and Turkey in the Syrian theater, following the fall of the Bashar al-Assad government in late 2024. Since Assad's departure, Ankara has expanded its political and military cooperation with Syria's new leadership and has been involved in efforts to train and rebuild the country's security forces. The United States has also criticized the Israeli strike on the airbase. Tom Barak, Washington's ambassador to Turkey and its special envoy for Syria, described the attack as unnecessary. He also said the United States was working to set up what he described as a deconfliction mechanism between Turkey, Israel, and Syria. According to Barak, Ankara was not warned in advance about the impending Israeli attack near its southern border. Meanwhile, Syrian Foreign Minister Asad al-Shaibani urged Israel to reconsider its approach towards Syria, saying it was now confronting not only Damascus, but also Syria's allies. This is Adam Morrow for A News in Istanbul, Turkey.
Now, Uzbekistan is rolling out new support for businesses with easier access to loans, export aid, and help with AI. Small firms will also get a 3-year break from most inspections. The measures are aimed at helping companies grow at home and expand into foreign markets. Severa Japova reports from Tashkent.
Uzbekistan is introducing new measures to make it easier for entrepreneurs to start, expand and modernize their businesses. Under the new package, businesses will be able to apply online for loans of up to $423,000, while startups can receive collateral-free loans of up to $16,900 through the new Business Start program. For loans of up to $846,000, entrepreneurs will only need to provide collateral covering 25% of the loan, with the remainder backed by state and banking guarantees. The government will also allocate $100 million to help businesses adopt artificial intelligence, covering half of eligible costs. Exporters will receive further support through a new export navigator system with $1 billion allocated to help companies find foreign buyers, meet international standards and improve logistics. The measures also include a 3-year moratorium on most inspections of small businesses and an average 50% reduction in financial fines. The government says the package is aimed at helping businesses expand production, attract investment and become more competitive in international markets. Sivir Rajab reporting from Tashkent, Uzbekistan, A News.
Now, Afghanistan's job market is coming under growing pressure, with the International Labour Organization warning that women are being pushed further out of the workforce. The return of Afghans from abroad and rising living costs are also making it harder for people to find work and support their families. Tamim Bahis reports.
5 years after the Taliban returned to power, the International Labour Organization says Afghanistan's labour market is becoming increasingly dependent on male employment, while women remain largely shut out of economic activity. According to its latest assessment, total employment has risen by around 14% from its 2022 low, reaching nearly 8.5 million people in 2026. But the organization says that increase has not kept pace with population growth. The employment to population ratio now stands at an estimated 32.5%, more than 4 percentage points below its 2020 level. The gains have also been concentrated entirely among men. Male employment is estimated to be around 22% higher than in 2020, while female employment has fallen sharply. Afghanistan is now estimated to have the second lowest female labour force participation rate in the world. The ILO says the return of large numbers of Afghans from Iran and Pakistan is creating additional pressure, with many arriving in communities already facing poverty, underemployment and limited livelihood opportunities. It also warns that more than 70% of Afghan workers are employed in sectors exposed to rising energy prices and inflation linked to the Middle East crisis. The organization is calling for greater support for private sector development, small businesses and labor-intensive industries, while expanding employment opportunities for women, young people, returnees and other vulnerable groups. Tamim Bahis in Kabul, iNews.
Now, Islamabad is preparing to receive Syria's Foreign Minister Assad al-Shabani for a two-day visit, the first by a Syrian foreign minister since the fall of Bashar al-Assad. The visit marks a new step in ties between the two countries. Miriam Zia reports from Islamabad.
Syria's new leadership is looking to deepen ties with Pakistan. Foreign Minister Assad al-Shabani arrives in Islamabad on Wednesday for a two-day visit. Al-Shabani is expected to meet Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif and Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister Ishaq Dar, as well as country's defense and commerce ministers. The talks are expected to focus on defense cooperation, economic ties and regional security, including developments in Syria and the wider Middle East. The visit will be first by a Syrian foreign minister to Pakistan since Bashar al-Assad was ousted in December 2024. The previous visit by a Syrian foreign minister took place in May 2007. Pakistan and Syria have maintained political and military ties for decades, including military training exchanges. Islamabad also kept its embassy in Damascus open throughout the Syrian conflict and maintained diplomatic representation after Assad's removal. However, the two countries currently lack a formal framework for broad cooperation. The visit comes as Damascus seeks to expand its regional partnerships and Islamabad looks to build on its long-standing ties with Syria amid major political and security changes in the Middle East. Mariam Zia, iNews, Islamabad.
All right, after the break, we'll look at all the top stories making the headlines today. Stay with us. Welcome back. You're still watching Primetime. Now, the UAE says it stopped trading with Iran until further notice. The decision follows the Defense Ministry's announcement that 2 Iranian ballistic missiles had been detected while targeting its territory.
All trade, commercial exchanges, and financial transactions with Iran have been halted by the United Arab Emirates. That's according to Afra al-Hamali, director of the UAE Foreign Ministry's Strategic Communications Department. She confirmed the move in a social media post and said it was prompted by developments that undermine regional and international peace and security. The announcement comes after the UAE said its air defense systems detected 2 ballistic missiles launched from Iran towards the country on Tuesday. Officials said the missiles were targeting maritime traffic. One fell outside UAE territorial waters, while the other came down inside them. No casualties or damage have been reported. Iran rejects the UAE's account. On Wednesday, Foreign Ministry spokesman Esmail Baghaei called the allegations baseless and said Abu Dhabi's actions went against good neighborly relations and efforts to build trust in the region. The UAE had also recently accused Iran of attacking vessels operated by state energy firm ADNOC while they were traveling through the Strait of Hormuz. Tehran has not claimed responsibility for those incidents. The UAE still reaffirmed its support for dialogue, cooperation, and regional integration.
Now, several Ukrainian cities have come under overnight Russian drone strikes, with casualties reported in Kherson and Zaporizhia. Russia, meanwhile, says its air defenses intercepted a large number of Ukrainian drones across multiple regions.
4 people were killed and 4 others injured after a Russian drone struck a fixed-route minibus in Kherson. That's according to Ukrainian authorities. Kherson governor said the injured passengers were all women and were taken to hospital. Ukrainian prosecutors say they've opened a war crimes investigation into the attack. Ukraine's Air Force said Russia launched 2 Iskander-M ballistic missiles and 65 drones overnight, including Shahed and other types of UAVs. Ukrainian forces said they destroyed or jammed 58 aerial targets. Separately, Russian drone strikes on the Ukrainian city of Zaporizhia killed 1 person and injured 7 others overnight, according to Ukraine's State Emergency Service. The strike sparked a fire on the 2nd floor of a hostel, where rescuers recovered 1 body from the rubble. A furniture store was also set ablaze, while a nearby apartment building sustained damage, including shattered windows and a damaged roof. Meanwhile, Russian authorities reported hundreds of Ukrainian drones were intercepted overnight across several regions. Drone activity was also reported near Dzержinsk, where local media said explosions and smoke were seen near the Sverdlov explosives plant. Russia's defense ministry also said a cargo vessel carrying military supplies was struck in the Black Sea near Odessa.
South Korea and the United States are cutting short their joint military drills, following calls from Donald Trump to scale back the exercises. The move comes as Washington seeks to improve ties with North Korea. Here's more.
South Korea and the United States are changing the scope of their annual joint military exercise, following a proposal from Washington. Seoul's Joint Chiefs of Staff said on Wednesday that the Ulchi Freedom Shield exercise would be modified in terms of its duration, scale, and other elements, while continuing to meet its main training and defense goals. The exercise, which began on Monday, had been due to run into next week. It'll now end on Friday, shortening the drills from 11 days to 5.
At the US side's proposal, the Republic of Korea and the United States agreed to make certain adjustments to the duration, scale, and other aspects of the exercise. First, they agreed to adjust the duration of this UFS exercise to run from the 17th through the 21st.
The US Defense Department said some activities had been cancelled or replaced by simulations, while essential readiness and training objectives would be maintained. The move follows an order from President Donald Trump on Sunday to substantially reduce American participation, with Trump citing his very good relationship with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. North Korea has condemned the drills, with state media saying on Wednesday that they increased tensions on the Korean peninsula and that Pyongyang would continue to exercise its right to self-defense. The development comes amid reports that Trump is pushing for another meeting with Kim Jong-un as early as this autumn. The Wall Street Journal, citing US officials, reported that Trump has discussed meeting Kim during a possible November trip to Asia. The meeting could take place during Trump's possible trip to China for the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit, though Reuters could not immediately verify the report.
Now, Washington is giving Canada 3 more days to reach a trade deal after Donald Trump delayed a planned 50% tariff on Canadian imports. The delay follows 2 calls between Trump and Prime Minister Mark Carney in the past 2 days. Carney says major progress has been made, but important work remains. The US and Canada traded around $880 billion in goods and services last year. Now, UK inflation has hit its highest level since March. Rising gas and electricity bills were the main driver, with the annual inflation rate reaching 2.9% in July, presenting a challenge for Prime Minister Andy Burnham, who has pledged to make tackling the cost of living a priority for his government.
UK inflation rose to 2.9% in July, as higher household energy bills added to the pressure on household finances. The Office for National Statistics says the annual rate of inflation increased from a 15-month low of 2.6% in June. The rise was in line with economists' forecasts and marks the first increase in the annual inflation rate since March. A key factor was the cost of gas and electricity, after the household energy price cap increased by 13% at the start of July. The jump in energy prices came as global energy markets faced renewed volatility following the conflict involving Iran. The ONS also pointed to other pressures on household spending. Furniture prices fell by less than usual for this time of year, while clothing prices also saw a smaller decline as retailers offered fewer discounts. There was some relief elsewhere in the data. Prices for raw materials and goods leaving factories rose more slowly in July, helped by lower crude oil and refined petroleum prices. Core inflation, which excludes energy and food prices, also rose slightly more than expected, coming in at 2.6%. The figures are likely to be closely watched by the Bank of England as it considers the outlook for inflation, household finances, and interest rates.
Now, Russia's ambassador to Azerbaijan has been summoned to the foreign ministry after Baku lodged objections to what he calls provocative, insulting, and threatening media statements targeting the country and its people. Officials cited recent broadcasts on Russian TV and radio, including Chistota Ponimania on Sputnik Radio and Spaz TV. Baku has urged Moscow to take immediate action. The Russian Foreign Ministry says the comments did not reflect Moscow's official position. It stressed that bilateral relations with Baku should develop in line with the 2022 Declaration on Allied Interaction. Now, record heat is spreading across Europe's seas this summer, with the Mediterranean among the areas most affected. Scientists say climate change is driving more frequent and stronger marine heat waves, raising concerns for marine life and coastal areas.
Human-caused climate change was the main driver of recent record-breaking sea temperatures around Europe. That's according to scientists, after the average temperature last month was around 27 degrees Celsius on the continent. The heat has also continued into August. Near Majorca, an offshore buoy recorded sea temperatures of 33 degrees Celsius earlier this month. A new analysis by the World Weather Attribution Group estimates that climate change has added around 2 degrees of warming to the Mediterranean and about 1.4 degrees to Western European seas. The study found that the extreme temperatures recorded this year in the eastern and western Mediterranean, along the Bay of Biscay and around the Iberian coast, would have been virtually impossible without human-caused climate change. The consequences are already being felt by marine life. Hotter seas can cause mass die-offs of species such as corals, disrupt food supplies, and affect birds and marine mammals further up the food chain. Marine ecologist John Bruno from the University of North Carolina says some species are moving north in search of cooler waters. But not all species will be able to adapt quickly enough. He says many are now approaching the absolute biological limits of adaptation. The analysis estimates that around 90% of the Bay of Biscay and 80% of the Western Mediterranean have experienced marine heatwave conditions this year. Without global warming, researchers say, that figure would have been closer to 40%.
All right, it's been a pleasure bringing you Primetime tonight. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned to A News.